Okay, hello all. So this is the kind of first in a series of videos just going through the different ideologies that we've looked at in class so far. I thought this would be, say, a more helpful form of revision if you want to go over ideologies again, rather than just having to look through the PowerPoint. You can watch me or listen or whatever, but all I want to do is to make sure I go through each of those categories, talk about some of the defining debates within conservatism as well. Just so we can kind of recap and go over this again in your own spare time. So let's make a start then. So just some of the things that we're going to cover in this little online session today, starting with conservatism, and I will do videos on the other ones. We're going to explain the conservative view on human nature, society, the state, and the economy, first off. Secondly, we're going to explain the differing views of various strands of conservatism as well, and then we're going to highlight the tensions that exist within those strands, as well as looking at some of the key thinkers that we know we have to include in our essays to highlight some example use. So let's start with a bit about the origins of conservatism, where it kind of comes from. So it's a reaction to the politics of the Enlightenment at the time. As we discussed with liberalism last year, the Enlightenment was a period in which different scientific thinkers are starting to think about the world around them in a different light, in a different form. So they start to place their emphasis on science rather than religion and tradition. What conservatives saw was that the Enlightenment wasn't necessarily a good thing or a positive thing, or that the Enlightenment was happening too fast. So we almost needed to pump the brakes a little bit on the social change that was happening in society. So the Enlightenment, as we've just kind of mentioned, espoused that politicians should strive towards the ideal society, and that such an ideal society exists. And this was really showcased in two events. So the English Glorious Revolution in 1689, the subsequent Bill of Rights, the establishment of parliamentary sovereignty over the monarch, and the American Declaration of Independence as well in 1776 showcased these Enlightenment principles that we can reject absolute monarchy, we can reject tradition that has existed for hundreds or thousands of years, and we can kind of move on. And the beginnings of the French Revolution did this as well. So from a period of about 1789 till about 1792, up until the king is pretty much killed, or former king, the Enlightenment looked like it was going pretty well in France. But by 1792, these Enlightenment principles started to look shocking to some of the kind of thinkers in Europe at the time. Not all of them, but some of them. So, for example, King Louis the 16th, he was executed, as well as Marie Antoinette, and the violence became the means in which you are going to secure enlightened principles. And that was an issue to some thinkers, to some kind of to people, because violence is not progress. In fact, violence is actually going backwards. So perhaps, as I said earlier, we need to slow down the change that's happening in society. So what these events really did in the French Revolution was made it possible to critique the Enlightenment and rapid progress without seeming like you were a regressive. If you did so before the French Revolution, if you critiqued the Enlightenment, you were just seen as someone that was upholding monarchy, was upholding repression, etc. Now you can point to the violence and you can say that, look, we need to kind of stop, slow down, actually put our faith in tradition instead. So let's have a look next at human nature, society, economy, and the state. Okay, so our kind of four key thinking categories for each ideology. So let's start with human nature. So the conservative ideology is much more cynical than liberalism or socialism in their views on human nature. And conservatism sees peoples as flawed and imperfect. So there's never going to be a utopian society, and that is due to the fact that humans are imperfect. That human nature is pretty much fixed to conservatives, cannot be improved. There's always going to be imperfect parts of humans. You can't change it. So, for example, for people like Thomas Hobbes, people were ruthless, selfish, calculating, and competitive. So formal authority was then needed to prevent hatred and war that might exist within society because of that imperfection. However, he did see people to an extent as rational, to an extent, but their selfishness is going to overpower that. In addition, Edmund Burke denied human rationality, instead pointing to what people actually place their faith in, which was custom, habit, and experience, as well as guising behavior. So he shared Hobbes' view that they were flawed, humans, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're terrible at the same time. So Burke wrote around little communities based around this tradition, this custom, this habit, and the culture. And he placed great emphasis on the church as well. And Oakshot later added this, talking of an innate fear of the unknown, that we as humans, we're so comfortable in our habits and our customs. That's why we pretty much all have the same kind of day-to-day routine, is because we're comfortable within that. Anything outside of that, we're scared of it. We're anxious of it. It's unknown. So we don't go over there. We don't try to implement that or even think about it. And new right thinkers wrote of the ability for enterprise and innovation, on the other hand, within people. So instead, we can be aspiring, but at the same time, new right thinkers said you needed the restraint of formal authority and community still to keep you in check. That too much freedom is going to see too much of that human imperfection coming out. So with regards to society, so most conservatives do agree that society exists, and Burke wrote about these little platoons, so local communities that provide security, status, inspiration, as well as some forms of control. Not all conservatives share this view. In fact, Margaret Thatcher did say there was no such thing as society, although she said that history was also that living tapestry of men and women living together. So would that be a society? I don't know. But there are varying different opinions from conservatives on whether society exists or not. Conservatives, those do look at society, see it as something that's organic, that emerges naturally, rather than something that can be created over time. Therefore, society is pretty unpredictable. You can't guess where it's going to go. You can't plan where it's going to go. And if you do, as is the case in France, where you get rid of the king, you get rid of your tradition, and you replace it with a constitution that is just creating a whole new society, well, you're going to end up into violence or some forms of hatred or whatever. So conservatives deal with society in a practical way. They stress empiricism, not necessarily thinking of how society should be or a direction it should be taking. So we're going to look at evidence and we're going to say that works. So we're going to focus on that. Conservatives also put great importance on tradition, and they resist radical change as well. So they also stress what they call Judeo-Christian morals, placing your ideals, your faith, your beliefs in Christianity and the morals that are put within the Bible. Conservatives also stress the importance of hierarchy, and they accept inequality, though some see it as a duty of those at the top to look after those at the bottom. So we got two kind of different thoughts with regards to social class and inequality. A very kind of traditional conservative viewpoint in society is, of course, noblesse oblige, that people below them, as at the time would be, say, the peasants, should listen to, put their faith in nobles because they're smart, they're intelligent, they know what to do, so you should just listen to what they say. And at the same time, you shouldn't really have to care for the peasants either, because they make their own choices and they've got their lot in life, so just leave them alone. One Nation conservative thinkers, on the other hand, stress the importance of paternalism. That actually you turn noblesse oblige around and say, on the other hand, rather than us telling them what to do all the time, not helping them, saying it's their fault if they're in some forms of poverty, instead it can be our duty that actually we should look to help those at the bottom, maybe through a little bit of social reform, a little bit of welfare, but not going all out like a socialist state. And in addition, property and then that ability to inherit property are important as well. So it's seen as a way of giving people a stake in society, that you've got your own little house and your garden, you can take care of that, it's your place, and it's therefore key in maintaining society and keeping it going. The state. So the ideal conservative state emerges slowly over time. So it adapts to the world as it does. So the UK state and the UK constitution is going to be ideal to the conservative thinking because we haven't had any mass social change or very quick social change. It's been evolved. The powers of the monarch have withered away to give way to parliamentary sovereignty. That was ideal. That was needed at the time. It was pretty slow. So you see this as creating a state that deals with the world as it is, rather than ideology. So much more empirical, evidence-based. So there should be law and order and authority within your state. It's the state's job to keep people in check, as we said, because Hobbes said people are imperfect. Well, you need the state to rein that in. If you don't have any law and order, conservatives say that nobody can enjoy rights because humans would be so imperfect, there would just be so many problems, continual war, that, again, you can't enjoy your rights and your freedoms that people want. So most conservatives believe that there should be a ruling class that are kind of brought up to rule. So, I mean, we just have to look at the numbers of UK prime ministers, for example, that have gone to Eton or just private schools in general, and top universities. And you can see that a trend there whereby there's a link between the upper class, having a lot of money, going to a kind of high level institution, one with a good reputation, and then going on to be in a position where there's a management role or a place where you're going to rule. So the nation state as well, that combination of bringing together the ideals of the nation and the state then representing that, is also vitally, it's vital, and it's particular in the UK and the USA. Often you'll see the state or state buildings flying flags, for example, and it forms a major part of national identity, which links traditions and the political leaders together. So maybe not so much now, I mean, maybe to an extent, but the form of faith in the monarch within the UK, the faith, the love for the position of president by the people of the United States, and to a conservative, that again is ideal. So for the economy, conservatives defend inequality and support hierarchy, and therefore they support capitalism, because capitalism, you're going to see these types of societies and states exist. So the uncontrolled nature of a free market, however, doesn't necessarily fit with the traditional conservative values. As we know, traditional conservatives place great faith in order and stability. You don't get order and stability in capitalism. You get your highs, you get your lows, you get your crashes, for example. And their skepticism stretches to markets that they don't think will always achieve what is best. So there's an acceptance, but at the same time, a little bit of reluctance too. So it led traditional conservatives and One Nation conservatives to some forms of state intervention. So, for example, protectionism, where you place tariffs on foreign goods to protect the industries and markets within your nation state. Okay, this is in complete contrast to liberals or classical liberals who stated that you shouldn't have any state intervention, the market knows what's best. So the new right, further along down the line, completely embraced free market economics, as shown under Thatcher and Reagan. They said, on the other hand, that putting protectionism, intervening in the economy, is slowing it down. Instead, leave it alone. Let the market do what it wants, and it can speed up. It's going to slow down, but the best environment in which you can create economic growth is through a free market economy. And for the new right, the prosperity and wealth that you will generate within a free market economy, so you get rid of Keynes, it's going to, according to them, it will destroy socialism, and it's going to provide money for the police and the armed forces as well. So you can get rid of your arch nemesis in socialism for conservatives, and you can also then reinforce the state apparatus that you are creating and you're enforcing, so the police and the armed forces. So, just to summarise then some of the core ideals of conservatism that have kind of come out of the categories that we've just looked at. So overall, conservatives are pretty pragmatic. Okay, they base their decisions on the experience of what works. Can be pretty flexible at times. So you're going to be pragmatic because humans lack the rationality to comprehend abstract theories. So you just go with what works. So your traditional conservatives believe that you are pragmatic by facilitating natural change, but your One Nation conservatives, on the other hand, say that you need a middle way approach to it. Some government regulation in the economy, you promote growth and social harmony through wealth creation, you fund state welfare programs, for example. So there's different ways in which they're differently pragmatic, but both pragmatic. Tradition. So the accumulated wisdom of past societies and a connection between the generations is really what tradition is all about. Can I look at a picture of my great grandfather my great-great-grandfather, my ancestors? Can I feel that I have a connection between them based on tradition, despite the fact that I've likely never even met them? So what tradition does, according to conservatives, is it creates stability as society does not change much. Therefore, it's linking together organic change, and that organic change is through tradition. So religious fundamentalists also place great faith in tradition. Social practices are seen as kind of God-given, that we're going to place our tradition and our faith within tradition as well. And also secular justifications as well. So traditional practice have proved fit for purpose, and they're therefore valuable. So they should be preserved to establish continuity, social stability. Future generations can also benefit, and it also provides an identity. Conservatives believe that if you don't place faith in tradition or some form of tradition, then you're pretty lost because you've got nothing to identify yourself with. You don't have a goal that you think you're going towards or what you are trying to preserve in life. Finally, human imperfection. So as we know, people are flawed. They can't make decisions for themselves. Therefore, you need tough law and order to restrain them in. You're going to have a foreign policy that is based on national security and the recognition of competitiveness, self-interest, which is going to also be the most powerful motivator for people. So it's psychologically dependent, okay? People crave security and familiarity, you know, and at the same time, we're still morally imperfect, we're selfish and we're greedy. But we're also intellectually imperfect as well as being morally imperfect as well. So we're limited in our reasoning and our intelligence, according to conservatives, or at least the common people are. So those that are upper class are, yeah, they're going to be morally imperfect, but they're going to be less intellectually imperfect than you. That's why they can make the decisions for you. So in addition, to go through a couple of other core ideals as well. So of course, they place great faith in the kind of organic society and a state. So a society and a state is more important than the individual parts that are there within society. The state is like a living organism. All the parts work together like a human body. So your government might be the heart or the brain, and your armed forces and your police are the other parts of a human organ. So therefore, you can't separate people from society. So your state is going to be underpinned by natural hierarchy, so you're going to have inequalities. That's because different classes have different roles. Conservatives would say not everybody can be a surgeon, not everybody could be a postman or a retail worker or whatever. It just doesn't, it's not going to suit them. They say that there's just certain types of people that are going to fit certain types of roles, and that's what they're going to fill. And your organic state in society is, of course, going to be reinforced by authority. That authority is going to encourage social cohesion, make sure we all have the same values and principles. Otherwise, you're going to disagree and there's going to be arguments, and make sure that people have a kind of sense of identity and that they understand the expectations of them as well. That's why conservatives reject mass welfare, because if you have mass welfare, they argue that people don't care about their expectations anymore, that they don't feel like they have that much of a stake in society, so they just kind of drop that. Paternalism as well. So the government, by the people, they're going to be best equipped to lead by virtue of birth and inheritance and upbringing. And it's linked to hierarchy on the organic society, and that paternalism really was about the fact that they believed that these leaders would have wisdom and experience, therefore natural authority, so they would know what was best for the people, but also at the same time that they could help them as well. And of course, the idea of paternalism changed throughout time. So you could kind of have different types of paternalism. So maybe a soft type of paternalism, which people give consent to through voting, or a hard form of paternalism, which is more about imposing that paternalism regardless of consent. Whether people agree or not, well, I'm just going to tell you what to do anyway. So Disraeli is, of course, our key one nation conservative that we identify that new form of paternalism with. And he said that you are going to limit the likelihood of social revolution if people are looked after. Okay, if you look after people, then why are they going to turn to socialism? Because in fact, they're going to be quite happy. They're going to have their tradition, they're going to have the welfare if they need it, but they're also going to have the job and the structure that they need too. And that's one nation conservatives. Neoliberals, on the other hand, reject this kind of idea by Disraeli. As they say, it undermines human initiative. It's also going to lead to economic stagnation. Instead, place your faith in individualism and self-interest. And of course, neoliberals and the new right, of course, dislike that dependency culture as well, which they say that Disraeli is not creating, but taking parts of or making a smaller dependency culture. Of course, they see the ultimate dependency culture in socialist ideas. And finally, libertarianism also has a role to play within conservatism as well, depending on the conservatives. So, you know, some argue for minimal state intervention, maximum economic freedom, and a faith in the free market. So, and this is where we're likely going to see this mostly within key thinkers such as Rand and Nozick. So there would be moral objections to state welfare. Okay, so you roll back the state. The state is going to create a dependency culture if it's too large, so get rid of it. If you have a dependency culture, then you're going to have an erosion of parental responsibility for children, and family institutions are going to be undermined. Nozick and others also say that redistribution of income is state robbery, as property is going to be transferred without consent. Taxation is robbery, as you are taking people's money. They should be able to do with it as they wish. And this is where we start to see the difference between your neoliberal thinkers and your more one nation and traditional thinkers. In that your neoliberals, not your entire new right, because of course they were advocating for neoconservatism as well, but those that just identify as neoliberals are going to have big disagreements with traditional conservatives with regards to their ideals on the state. Just to kind of summarize then the different strands and ideologies that exist within conservatism then, and we'll just go through one at a time. So your traditional conservatism, a response to the French Revolution. Okay, so conservatism's origins are found in the reaction to the French Revolution of 1789 and the work of Edmund Burke. These thinkers, especially Burke, they opposed revolutionary change and this egalitarian ideas and theories. So they reject the fact that the French Revolution was saying that you can just get rid of class, that there's complete equality between brotherhood. Not at all. Traditional conservatives disagree. They place great faith in order, tradition, evidence and empiricism, and property as well. They believe that there's an organic development of state and society over time, that it's not forced. They defend the elite rule and inequality that exists within society as well. And maybe some forms of moderate reform, not going too far, but that they recognize over time, you know, just like One Nation conservatives do as well, that you need to have some change eventually, because things just become out of date. So, for example, the emancipation and the abolition of slavery across the British Empire in 1833. And, for example, Prime Minister Peel's support for the Great Reform Act of 1832 as well, which essentially established the kind of constituency system that we have today. So eventually you will make some change in society. One Nation conservatism, on the other hand, so this we can link to people like Disraeli on the left here in Britain, Otto von Bismarck in Germany, and it's very much a response to the popularity of socialism that starts to grow in the 1850s and the 1860s. One Nation conservatives embrace nationalism. It was previously opposed by conservatives, as it was, apologies for the typo, as it was linked to the 1848 revolutions, in which people across Europe were revolting against leaders across the country, kings and monarchs, and placing great faith in their nationalistic thinking. So, for example, the modern German flag that we see today, with the red, the yellow, and the black stripe, was created in the 1840s. And conservatives initially rejected that because it was a fight back against the ruling elite at the time and tradition. But by the 1870s, conservatives recognized the power that nationalism has, the fact that it can bring people together and you can create a tradition that is based around nationalism. You know, people weren't thinking that maybe in the same forms of nationalism in the 1700s as they do now. But what Disraeli and Bismarck recognized is that actually you can be quite romantic in your thinking of nationalism. You can say that, well, the idea of a German or the idea of a Briton, people may not have recognized it 100 years ago, but it did exist. And you're going to place great faith and great emphasis on the identity around the flag as well. So you embrace class difference, You still say it exists, but you focus on a national family instead, so that the nation state was something that all classes should defend, not just the ruling class, that the working class as well should place great faith in their nation. You also emphasize tradition still. You place great faith in your institutions, but a switch from traditional thinking is that now you also focus on the expansion of empire and imperialism overall. And you see this in the late 1880s with the Congress in Berlin, the scramble for Africa, Britain's imperial wars against tribes in South Africa, such as the Zulus, and the Boer War from 1899 to 1902. So you do see imperialism becoming a main form of conservatism as well. The ruling class, Disraeli also recognised, have a paternal responsibility to improve the lives of the lower classes. So, for example, you bring in some larger state-sponsored social reform. So, unlike those, if we go back to our traditional examples, unlike these, which are very much political in thinking, these reforms are much more about improving the lives and the working conditions of the people. So a Second Great Reform Act in 1868, a Factory Act in 1874 to make factory work a little bit safer. In Germany, for example, there was a state-backed insurance against illness and old age a lot earlier than there was in Britain. That didn't exist in Britain until about 1911, but it already existed in Germany in the 1800s. Bismarck also introduced a pension scheme too. So Germany really was at the forefront of this one nation conservative thinking in terms of being conservative but bringing about social reforms at the same time. Christian democracy, another form of kind of one nation thinking, but placing your faith in your morals and somewhere else. So it's very much a European form of conservatism, shaped largely by revolutions, defeats in wars, and a response to fascist nationalism as well. So it's very much a product of the 1930s and the 1940s. It's based on Judeo-Christian morality, so authority, hierarchy. You also are very socially conservative because you're placing your ideals in Judeo-Christian morality, where we can see social conservatism as well. So, for example, you oppose abortion, you oppose sexual equality. You do have reservations about free market economics, so you do kind of have a social market, you do have intervention within the economy. And you do accept an enlarged state with welfare provision as well. So you can see elements of Christian democracy of one nation conservatism, but it's much more focusing on religion, which wasn't necessarily the case with Disraeli and Bismarck. So these European conservatives as well are less focused on the nation state, unlike these one nation conservatives, and they're much more likely to accept supranational organizations such as the European Union. Again, a much more showcase of the fact that it was a product of the time. Countries like Germany and Italy, they come out of World War II defeated, and then they are democratic countries, not East Germany, but West Germany. And they see these supranational organizations as actually organizations for peace. So, you know, the big six get together, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, Germany, and they form the very early European coal and steel community. Next form, of course, we have the New Right, a big divergence from some of the conservative thinking that we looked at prior. So it emerges as a result of failing Keynesian economics. So in the 1970s, as we discussed in class, you see mass stagflation. So some of the features of the New Right then that exist. So they oppose economic intervention, and they have a form of anti-permissiveness within society. They endorse traditional values, such as family values, respect for authority, and the benefit of hard work as well. They're pretty reactionary, so they favour a return to where things were or the way things used to be, that you recognise a society before or a state that was better, so we should go back. And there's two strands of the New Right that we can recognise. Not all New Right thinkers or New Right people are encompassing both, but in our examples of Reagan and Thatcher, we really do see elements of both. So in neoconservatism, we see an emphasis on social order. We reintroduce discipline and hierarchy. We definitely see that in Thatcher's reaction to the miners' strikes in the early 1940s. Emphasis on traditional values. You combat crime. You place emphasis on family values. And a strong state is going to enforce these. Okay, and we see that again in Thatcher's Clause 28, banning the advertisement of LGBT couples or values within advertising for local authorities, and instead placing your faith or your family values in terms of heterosexual couples and families. You also have an emphasis on public morality. So new right thinkers may argue this, that if an individual has freedom over their morality, they might adopt the following two things: immoral behavior, or they might undermine the development of a common morality. So instead, the government should push morality. So then we all believe the same morals, we're less likely to argue and fight. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, another strand of the new right thinking. So an emphasis, as we said earlier, on the free market. The free market, according to Thatcher and Reagan, can meet consumer demand and it can produce prosperity as well. Inflation. So you reduce inflation, and this was really the big kind of talking points in the 70s and 80s. What you do is you reduce inflation by cutting public service money, known as supply side economics. We don't need to get into the economics too much, but that you cut public services and prices are going to stop rising as you're not spending as much money. You reject government intervention. This is going to lead to economic inefficiency and a lack of incentive as well. And you also place great emphasis on an atomistic individualism, and that individuals can only be protected by rolling back the state. And we really see that in our key thinker of Rand. So those are our different strands of conservatism. So let's just generally go over tensions that exist within conservatism as well. So let's start with human nature, and we'll just kind of go through each strand and where they kind of see the differences between the two. So traditional conservatives such as Burke and Oakshot, they're pretty skeptical about human nature. They see horrors of idealistic movements such as the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. They're not accidents. They actually arise from a misreading and an overestimation of human potential that exists within society. So don't create a society, because you're then going to have the French and Russian revolutions. New right thinkers, on the other hand, much more optimistic, and they emphasize the possibilities of individuals with initiative and liberty. So, for example, key thinkers like Nozick and Rand, they take an especially positive view on what individuals can achieve in the economic sphere in particular. And they argue that the key to unlocking human potential lies in fostering a pro-capitalist environment where individual energies are unleashed. If you get rid of that dependency culture, people understand their stake in society, they know they have to work hard, so they will go and do so. So what about society then? Where do the tensions exist there? So your traditional conservatives see society as a collection of small communities. So as we mentioned earlier, Burke terms these as little platoons. And they're overseen by a hierarchical structure in which paternalistic elites exercise their inherited power in the interests of the majority. So such communities are considered pretty organic in the sense that they emerge in a natural and a kind of unplanned way, and they place great store upon tradition and continuity. So, for example, London, of course, was settled by the Romans initially as Londinium, and then has grown over time to become the London that we know now. So that's just kind of a small example of what Burke would see as a kind of little platoon that's grown larger over time. By contrast, new right conservatives, they're pretty ambivalent about society's very existence. They draw upon the libertarian belief that society is a mere collection of atomized individuals seeking self-determination. So new right conservatives are much more skeptical about the paternalistic communities, and they much prefer a society that's defined by those who have achieved rather than inherited power, status and property as well. So this is what we would call as meritocracy. So yeah, in other words, a society that's much more meritocratic rather than aristocratic. Again, you know, just as traditional conservatives argued that, you know, aristocracy is good. Those people know what they're doing. Well, do they? That's basically the argument from new right conservatives. We can look at some pretty terrible leaders. We can look at some pretty terrible monarchs. I mean, you know, King John, for example, the Magna Carta was only signed because he was such a terrible king. So just because somebody is part of the aristocracy doesn't necessarily mean that they should have the right to rule. So what about the state? So traditional conservatives like Burke, they defend a state where political power is wielded by those who are born to rule, so that noblesse oblige that we mentioned earlier. So as such, traditional conservatives believe that the best states have a natural ruling class, and they're reared according to the principles of duty and sacrifice, and instilled with a sense of responsibility towards the governed. And traditional conservatives are pretty pragmatic about the extent of the state, and they're prepared to enlarge it in the name of social stability and one nation as well. So by contrast, on the other hand, new right conservatives wish to roll back the frontiers of the state. So outside of areas, of course, such as security and defense, for the most part, new right leaders, maybe not all of the thinkers, but new right leaders such as Thatcher and Reagan, they've rolled back the state, but in fact, security and defense has been increased. And you can see that, of course, in the Falklands War, for instance. And this is to advance individual freedom and reverse the dependency culture. So you roll back the state and the economy, you get rid of dependency culture, and then that security that you've created is actually going to advance individual freedom rather than negate it. So new right conservatives are pretty hostile to the principle of aristocratic rule, as we've mentioned, and they fear that the ruling class have too much stake in the status quo and are therefore reluctant to admit the need for radical change by new right governments. So that the ruling class, they're pretty rich, they're pretty happy, so why would they bother doing anything? Because they're pretty happy with what's going on. So the new right recognise that, well, actually, no, that's wrong. Sometimes you do have to make some radical change, and you do have to roll back the state. So what about the economy? Traditional conservatives, they're pretty keen to defend an economy that's based on private ownership. They're pretty skeptical about free market capitalism, and they're fearful that its dynamic their dynamic effects exacerbate inequality, and they threaten one nation, and they fuel support for socialism as well. So as capitalism becomes more globalized over time, traditional conservatives also fear that market forces promote a more cosmopolitan society that's eroding national identity and national culture. So as a result, traditional conservatives have been prepared to bring in some forms of state intervention via Keynesian economics. So higher taxation, higher public spending on state welfare as well. So by contrast, new right conservatives, the complete opposite. So thinkers like Nozick zealously advocate free market economics, where state functions are privatized and deregulated, and where levels of taxation and state spending are significantly reduced. Of course, like Nozick said, and as we mentioned before, he says taxation is theft, so you shouldn't really have any, and he would be much at odds with the National Health Service. So last slide then, just to go through our key thinkers. So we'll start with our first one, Thomas Hobbes, and I'll just go through some of his works and some of the principles for each. So in his work Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes argued for total obedience to absolute government. And he said the alternative of absolute government would be chaos, because you need that strong state to bring in people. He argued about a state of nature where people are equal and free, but that's going to lead to conflict. And unlike I'll make a comparison here between him and John Locke. John Locke, of course, said that the state of nature that existed prior was something that was pretty good. You didn't have a state that kind of restricted your freedoms. Everybody was at least pretty happy, and they all kind of had great faith in their little communities that they lived in. Well, Hobbes says, on the other hand, actually, if you look at prior society, if you look at it before there was a state, if you just look at, just think about stereotypical cavemen, they're pretty violent people. And the people they had across the road from them, they would be at great odds at and probably go to war with them. So Hobbes argues the complete opposite there, saying that it wasn't necessarily a good thing. Therefore, what Hobbes says is that people enter into a social contract with the government to establish political authority. Okay, so you surrender all your natural rights, but your government is going to be established through the consent of the people to preserve order. So you can still vote out government if needed, because it is by consent. Hobbes also says that humans are not rational, they're needy, they're vulnerable, and therefore they compete violently as well. Humans, to Hobbes as well, are pretty easily led astray in their attempts to understand the world, because humans don't understand the world, Hobbes says. So if you just leave them alone, well, I'm going to try and work it out for myself, but that might always not lead to the best conclusions. So number two, Edmund Burke. He said the French Revolution was pretty bad at the end of the 1700s, because it tried to create a new system which was based on abstract principles. And he also talked about the fact that rather than mass social change, focus on pragmatism. focus on small evidence-based change over time. Burke recognized the fact that an organic state existed over time and that you should place your faith in that. So you would limit reform based on empiricism, so your direct experience, your evidence, and the tradition that has happened before. It's not a complete rejection of reform, but it's saying that it should be small and limited over time. So tradition over time should be respected. People knew what worked before, so we shouldn't say that that's anything different. It should be respected. You should promote social stability, as there is an obligation for each generation to pass on tradition and empiricism over time. And Burke would argue that it is the parents' job to raise their children in such a way, to teach them tradition. And your tradition is also going to provide a strong historical identity. So according to Burke, because if let's just say, for example, you were born in Britain, you can identify with the Britain that existed 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. And that is because we have been taught tradition, or so Burke says. Michael Oakshot. So he says that pragmatism is much more desirable as it delivers what's in the best interest of the people. So if you just look at what's happened before, that's probably worked according to Oakshot in the best interest of the people, so just kind of carry on in that same vein. He says that you can be pretty flexible. You reflect shifting social reality, while your ideology instead encourages dogmatic decision making. So he says that there's problems when you oversimplify complex situations that we can't understand. Oakshot just recognizes that we're not going to understand everything, unfortunately. So we need to just try and come up with the best solutions we can via pragmatism and empiricism. Rationalism's pretty bad as society, as well as too complex to understand. Again, we just can't get it, according to Oakshot. And a rational leader is going to act solely on the authority of his own reason, rather than experience. Okay, so let's take fascism for example. Both Hitler and Mussolini and Francisco Franco, they argued that they were acting on rationality, but Oakshot says that actually they just acted on the authority of their own reason. They weren't doing things in the best interest of their own people. They just thought that it would be better for them, or they thought that it would be better for society according to them. And he says that their entire ideology is just too complex, that the answers they're coming up with are just wrong because we can't answer those questions. Rand, who we've mentioned a couple of times throughout the clip, a couple of her kind of key points or key features. So one being objectivism, so libertarianism system advocating rational self-interest so that people can and people will want to be self-interested and pursue their own goals. Reason provides a fundamental basis of human life, and therefore she claims that rational pursuit of self-interest is morally right, and it should be able to do that. Altruism in society undermines the ability of people to use their reason as well. So she's anti-altruism. The non-aggression principle, okay, it is the opposition to external coercion of the individual through state welfare and taxation. Okay, so she recognizes that if the state has welfare, the state has excessive taxation. She calls that a non-aggression principle. She says that you should oppose that is external coercion of the individual, that because I have to pay a national insurance tax towards the NHS, they're coercing me towards believing that that's the correct thing to do. And laissez-faire economics as well. She placed great emphasis on that and respects the rational self-interest. Okay, what's important to remember about Rand is that a lot of her ideology actually comes through in books that she writes that are fiction books. They're not the kind of non-fiction discussing her ideology. They come through in her stories. And finally, Robert Nozick. Okay, so a couple of points that he kind of hits on is, of course, Robert Nozick, as we know, is that kind of ultimate or libertarian, places great faith in libertarianism, which is based on Kant's principle of ends, not the means. Since individuals are an end in themselves, they have the right, which are side constraints on actions of others. Sorry, they have rights which are side constraints on actions of others. So the government just needs to be rolled back. Taxes are pretty immoral, according to Nozick, as they are forced labour imposed on the individual. So they treat individual as a means for social justice. And finally, self-ownership as well. So give rights to elements making up oneself. Therefore, taxes are a form of slavery, according to Nozick, and people have partial property rights over the labour of individuals. So if we're going to summarise Nozick, and there's a lot of big words there, libertarianism, Nozick says, we need to roll back the state, we need to roll back taxation, and we need to emphasise individual freedom and choice over their own choices and whatever they want to make in life. So that's conservatism. Thank you all for watching, and I'm going to follow up this clip with other videos on our other topics we've covered as well. So obviously in our advanced information we have socialism and nationalism, but I'll probably make a liberalism one at some point anyway. Not that you need to go over that, but it's probably a clip I'll make anyway. So yeah, thank you all, and I'll